There is a mansion on a hilltop in Southern California that should not exist. It rises 350 feet above the Pacific Ocean on an island 22 miles from Los Angeles, white and austere like a New England governor's residence transported to the desert, built by a man who made his fortune selling 5-cent sticks of mint-flavored wax. William Wrigley Jr. had everything industrial capitalism could manufacture: factories, steamships, a baseball team, an entire island. Everything except the one thing he wanted most: acceptance. Not by the masses who chewed his gum, but by the bloodlines who controlled American society. This is the story of the Wrigley Mansion on Catalina Island. Not the sanitized tourist brochure version about a generous philanthropist, but the deeper, more uncomfortable tale of how a soap salesman's son tried to buy his way into heaven and ended up building a fortress of isolation instead. If you value deep investigations into the American obsession with private property, the invisible walls that separate new money from old, and the economics of building paradise, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now, let us descend into the peculiar madness of Santa Catalina Island. 1. The 5-cent emperor and the island he bought on Impulse Spring, 1919. William Wrigley Jr. sits in his Chicago office on Michigan Avenue looking at a hand-drawn map. The paper shows an oblong piece of rock in the Pacific, 76 square miles of California real estate that most businessmen consider worthless. No industry, no factories, no coal. Just mountains, wild goats, and a small fishing village called Avalon. Wrigley picks up the telephone. Within 48 hours, he wires approximately $3 million to the Banning brothers, heirs to a shipping fortune who have been bleeding money trying to turn Catalina into an exclusive resort for East Coast aristocrats. The deal closes before Wrigley even visits the property. He buys an island the way other men buy suits. This is not recklessness. This is the culmination of a philosophy forged in the street markets of 19th century Philadelphia. William Wrigley Jr. was born in 1861 into a family that made soap, not perfumed luxury soap for the wealthy, but industrial cleaning bars for factories and tenements. His father, also William, ran the business with Quaker strictness. The son proved unmanageable. School bored him. Rules infuriated him. At 11 years old, young William ran away to New York and survived by selling newspapers on street corners, sleeping in crates, learning the fundamental law of commerce that would define his empire. People do not buy products. They buy the feeling of getting more than they paid for. He returned home eventually. His father put him to work as a traveling soap salesman. The young Wrigley loaded a wagon and rode through Pennsylvania coal towns, knocking on doors, perfecting his pitch. Chavifam. Competition was brutal. Every town had a dozen soap peddlers. Wrigley needed an edge. He developed a tactic that would become his signature. The premium: buy a case of soap, get a free umbrella. Buy 2 cases, get a lamp. He was not selling soap. He was selling theater, spectacle, the illusion of abundance. By 1891, at age 29, he moved to Chicago with $32 in his pocket and a strategy that would reshape American consumer culture. He intended to sell his father's soap in the booming Midwest, but the market taught him a lesson. Nobody cared about his soap. They wanted the premiums. So he pivoted. He started selling the baking powder he had been giving away as a bonus. To move the baking powder, he attached 2 sticks of chewing gum to each can. And then the pattern repeated. Customers ignored the baking powder. They demanded more gum. In 1893, William Wrigley Jr. made the decision that would birth a fortune. He stopped selling everything else and focused entirely on chewing gum. Specifically 2 flavors, Juicy Fruit and Wrigley's Spearmint. The product was perfect. It cost almost nothing to manufacture. It disappeared after use, forcing constant repurchase. And crucially, it was priced at 5 cents, low enough that even factory workers could afford it, high enough to generate massive margins at scale. But the real genius was not the product. The real genius was the advertising. In 1907, the financial markets collapsed. Banks froze. Credit vanished. Across America, businesses cut their advertising budgets to zero, hoping to survive by hoarding cash. Wrigley saw the panic and did the opposite. He borrowed $250,000, a sum equivalent to over $7 million today, and spent every penny on advertising. Billboards, newspapers, magazine spreads. While his competitors went silent, Wrigley's name screamed from every available surface. When the economy recovered, only one chewing gum brand had survived in the public consciousness: Wrigley's. By 1910, his net worth exceeded $10 million. By 1915, it was $40 million, approximately $1.2 billion in modern terms. He was not old money. He had no pedigree, no lineage connecting him to the founding families of the Republic. He was a peddler who got lucky, and the East Coast establishment never let him forget it. This is where the psychological wound opens. Wrigley had wealth that dwarfed many aristocratic fortunes, but he could not buy entry into their drawing rooms. When he tried to join exclusive clubs in Chicago, he was politely declined. His wife, Ada Elizabeth Foote, whom he married in 1885, came from a respectable but unremarkable Michigan family. Not scandalous, but not Vanderbilt either. The social structure of early 20th century America was a caste system disguised as a meritocracy. New money could buy mansions, but it could not buy ancestry. And ancestry was the currency that mattered in the circles Wrigley wanted to enter. So he stopped trying to join their world. He decided to build his own. In 1916, Wrigley purchased the Chicago Cubs baseball team, not because he loved baseball, though he claimed to, but because owning a major league franchise was a form of civic power that did not require approval from bloodline gatekeepers. The team was a branding vehicle, a way to associate his name with something larger than chewing gum. But even this was not enough. He needed territory. He needed a kingdom where his word was not one voice among many, but the only voice that mattered. Santa Catalina Island appeared on his radar through a combination of business gossip and desperation. The Banning brothers, sons of Phineas Banning, who had made a fortune in California transportation, had owned the island since the 1890s. They tried to develop it as a resort for the wealthy, but disaster followed disaster. In 1915, a catastrophic fire destroyed half of Avalon, the island's only town. Tourism collapsed. Debt piled up. By 1919, the Bannings were quietly looking for a buyer. Wrigley heard about the opportunity through associates in Los Angeles. He did not commission a geological survey. He did not hire consultants to assess tourism potential. He looked at the map, saw an island within sight of the mainland, but separated by 22 miles of ocean, and understood immediately what it represented: autonomy. A place where he would not be a guest, a supplicant, or an outsider. A place where he would be sovereign. The purchase in 1919 gave him controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company, which owned most of the land and all the critical infrastructure: docks, utilities, transportation. Wrigley did not just buy real estate, he bought jurisdiction. The island had a tiny population, maybe 500 permanent residents, most of them fishermen and service workers. No entrenched power structure, no old families who could look down on him, just blank space waiting to be shaped. His vision for Catalina was radically different from the Bannings' exclusivity model. Wrigley hated aristocratic snobbery, at least in theory. He positioned himself as a populist. He wanted Catalina to be accessible to the working class, the people who bought his gum. A Chicago factory worker should be able to afford a weekend on the island. The steamship fare from Los Angeles was kept deliberately low. The hotel prices were reasonable. This was Wrigley's version of democracy. Controlled access to paradise, but access nonetheless. Of course, the contradiction was blatant. He preached accessibility while consolidating absolute private control. He was building a benevolent dictatorship. But dictatorships, even benevolent ones, require a command center. And so, almost immediately after acquiring the island, Wrigley began planning the structure that would define his reign. A house on the highest accessible point, a residence from which he could see everything and everyone, but from which he would remain separate, untouchable, elevated. The psychological architecture of the man was taking physical form. 2. The house that sees everything and reveals nothing. By 1920, the basic infrastructure of Wrigley's island empire was taking shape. He brought in David M. Renton, a logistics expert and manager who became his viceroy. Renton was the pragmatist who translated Wrigley's grand, often impulsive visions into concrete reality. If Wrigley said, "I want fresh water in the desert," Renton figured out how to build pipelines and reservoirs. If Wrigley said, "I want tourists to arrive by the thousands," Renton organized steamship schedules and pier expansions. But the most critical project, the one that revealed the true nature of Wrigley's ambitions, was the mansion. Wrigley selected a site that was both strategic and symbolic. On the eastern side of Avalon Bay rises a steep hill that the locals had no particular name for. Wrigley named it Mount Ada after his wife. This was not mere sentimentality. Naming the mountain after Ada was a dynastic gesture, a declaration that the Wrigley family would be inseparable from the island's geography. Future generations would speak the name Ada every time they referenced the landmark. Immortality through cartography. The chosen elevation was 350 feet above sea level, high enough to command a panoramic view of the bay, the town, the harbor, and the Pacific horizon, but not so high as to be inaccessible. The location had no road access. That was intentional. Wrigley wanted the approach to the house to be difficult, a climb that would remind visitors they were ascending toward power. The architect he selected was Wallace Neff, though some records suggest collaboration with other designers, including someone associated with Zachary Taylor Davis, who had designed Wrigley Field in Chicago. Regardless of the exact attribution, the design mandate was clear: build a house that does not belong to California. Wrigley rejected the Spanish colonial revival style that dominated Southern California architecture in the 1920s. He rejected the mission style with its romantic arches and terracotta tiles. Instead, he demanded Georgian colonial revival, the architecture of East Coast power: symmetry, restraint, white paint, columns. This was a deliberate provocation. The house was meant to look like it had been transplanted from Massachusetts or Virginia, a visual argument that Wrigley was not a Western parvenu, but the equal of Eastern elites. The building would impose order on the chaotic wild landscape of Catalina. It would stand out, a white monument visible from the sea, a lighthouse of authority. Construction began in 1920. The logistics were nightmarish. Every brick, every board, every bag of cement had to be shipped from the mainland to the island, then hauled up the steep serpentine road that Renton's crews carved into the hillside. The house would be built from a combination of imported materials and local stone quarried from the island itself. This fusion was symbolic. Wrigley was rooting his dynasty into the physical substance of Catalina, while simultaneously importing the aesthetic language of Eastern establishment power. The house took shape over 2 years. By 1921, it stood complete, a 3-story structure with an L-shaped footprint designed to embrace the hilltop and maximize views. The exterior was painted a blinding white, a color that required constant maintenance in the salt air, but which Wrigley insisted upon because white signified purity, cleanliness, and dominance over the environment. The interior was organized as a hierarchy of access and intimacy. The first floor was semi-public space designed to receive guests, business associates, and the occasional dignitary. The entrance hall was paneled in dark hardwoods, a somber introduction that signaled seriousness. To the left, a formal dining room with a redwood table that could seat 12. This was not a room for family dinners. This was a boardroom disguised as a dining room, a place where decisions affecting thousands of lives were made over roast beef and wine. But the true heart of the house was the solarium and the eastern terrace. This was Wrigley's command center. The room was designed with floor-to-ceiling windows that eliminated the boundary between interior and exterior. Standing in the solarium, Wrigley could see the entire bay spread below him like a map. He could watch the steamships arrive. He could monitor construction projects. He could observe the movements of people in the town. He installed a telescope on the terrace. Every morning at 11 o'clock, he would watch the steamer Avalon enter the harbor, counting passengers, gauging demand, calculating revenue. This was the physical manifestation of panopticon logic. Wrigley could see everyone, but no one could see him clearly. He was too far away, too elevated. The house was a watchtower. Adjacent to the solarium was the billiard room, a deliberate masculine counterpoint. Where the solarium was light and transparent, the billiard room was dark and enclosed. No windows, heavy furniture, a massive table with green felt. This was where private negotiations happened, away from the sunlight and scrutiny. The architectural message was clear: public observation in the solarium, private power in the billiard room. The second floor was the family's private domain. Ada Wrigley's bedroom was decorated in soft pastels, floral patterns, furniture that emphasized comfort over grandeur. Her windows faced west, away from the town, looking toward the wild interior of the island. This was her refuge from the world her husband was building. Ada was a pragmatist and a stabilizer, but she had no interest in empire management. Her room reflected that. It was turned away from the machinery of control. William's bedroom, by contrast, was Spartan. The bed was positioned to catch the first light of dawn. Next to it, a telephone with a direct line to David Renton. Even in sleep, Wrigley remained on call. His bathroom featured an engineering innovation, a dual water system that used seawater for non-drinking purposes, conserving the island's limited freshwater supply. Even in private space, Wrigley was thinking like an industrial manager. The third floor housed servants' quarters and technical rooms. The staff, cooks, maids, groundskeepers lived in the house, but in a separate vertical tier, physically above the family, but socially below. An electric bell system allowed the Wrigleys to summon servants without shouting or walking. The kitchen was equipped with massive iceboxes, precursors to refrigerators, and industrial-grade stoves. Food was shipped daily from the mainland. While Avalon residents ate local fish and canned goods, the Wrigley table featured Chicago steaks, oysters, and tropical fruit. The house also had its own electrical generator, independent of the town's power grid. If the island lost power, the mansion would remain lit. It was designed to be an autonomous fortress, a self-sufficient ark. But the most revealing architectural detail was the Otis elevator installed in the house, one of the first private residential elevators on the West Coast. Ostensibly, the elevator was a luxury, a symbol of modernity. But its true purpose became clear as Wrigley aged. The man who built his fortune on relentless energy was beginning to feel his body fail. The elevator allowed him to move between floors without revealing weakness. It preserved the illusion of vitality even as his heart began to falter. Surrounding the mansion, Ada Wrigley personally designed the gardens. She imported rare cacti and succulents from Mexico and South America, plants that could survive in Catalina's arid climate. She built terraces and stone pathways, creating a micro-landscape of order within the wild scrub of the island. The garden was her domain, the one part of the empire she controlled absolutely. While William managed the industrial machine below, Ada cultivated beauty above. By 1922, the Mount Ada mansion was complete and operational. It was not the largest house in California, but it was certainly the most strategically positioned. Standing on the terrace at sunset, Wrigley could watch the last light fade over the Pacific and see the lights of Avalon flicker on below. Every light represented a business he controlled: hotels, restaurants, the glass-bottom boats, the dance hall. The island was not just his property. It was his experiment in total social design. But architecture is an honest medium. It reveals what its builder values. And the Mount Ada Mansion, for all its grandeur, revealed something deeply paradoxical about William Wrigley Jr. He built a house that was simultaneously a monument to accessibility and a fortress of exclusivity. He preached populism while literally elevating himself above the population. He wanted to be loved by the masses, but trusted by no one. The house allowed him to watch the world without being part of it. This contradiction would define the final decade of his life. 3. The island as factory, the mansion as panopticon. Between 1921 and 1929, Santa Catalina Island underwent a transformation that was part urban planning, part social engineering, and part megalomaniacal theater. William Wrigley Jr., directing operations from his hilltop mansion, turned the island into the most aggressively managed tourist destination in America. And management in Wrigley's vocabulary meant control. He started with transportation. The Santa Catalina Island Company, which he now fully controlled, operated the steamship lines connecting the island to the mainland. The flagship vessel, the SS Avalon, could carry over 1,200 passengers. Ticket prices were kept deliberately affordable, approximately $3 round trip, equivalent to roughly $50 today. Cheap enough for working-class families, expensive enough to generate profit, at volume. The ships ran on a fixed schedule, multiple trips daily during peak season. This was vertical integration. Wrigley controlled the only practical way to reach the island, which meant he controlled the flow of people and money. Upon arrival, visitors found an island that looked spontaneous but was ruthlessly planned. The town of Avalon was redesigned to maximize tourist spending while maintaining aesthetic control. Buildings were required to conform to certain design standards. Neon signs were prohibited. Automobiles were banned except for essential services, a restriction that remains in effect today. Wrigley justified the car ban as environmental preservation, but the real reason was control. If tourists could not drive, they had to use Wrigley's buses and taxis. If they could not explore independently, they had to book Wrigley's tours. The economic model was extractive, but not exploitative by the standards of the era. Wrigley paid his workers well, better than comparable. Jobs on the mainland. This was not generosity. This was strategic. High wages reduced labor unrest and ensured employee loyalty. Workers who were well paid were less likely to organize unions or challenge management. Wrigley understood that a content workforce was a controllable workforce. But the most audacious move came in 1921 when Wrigley brought the Chicago Cubs to the island for spring training. This decision reshaped the island's identity and demonstrated Wrigley's genius for integrated marketing. Every spring, the Cubs and their opponents would train on Catalina. Sports writers from across the country descended on the island to cover the team. Their dispatches, published in newspapers from Boston to San Francisco, invariably mentioned sunny Catalina and William Wrigley's Island Paradise. Wrigley received millions of dollars in free publicity. The Cubs were not just a baseball team. They were a marketing platform. The ball field was built on the edge of Avalon, within sight of the Mount Ada Mansion. Wrigley could watch practice sessions through his telescope. He attended games personally, sitting in a private box, waving to the crowd. The message was clear. The owner was watching. Not just watching the team, but watching everything. From his terrace, Wrigley monitored the entire operation. He could see when the steamships were running behind schedule. He could see when crowds were forming at the pier. He could see construction projects progressing or stalling. The house functioned as a literal command post. Renton would climb the hill daily to report on operations, standing in the solarium like a general briefing his commander. But Wrigley's populist rhetoric masked a fundamentally hierarchical reality. Down in Avalon, tourists enjoyed affordable fun: the beach, the casino, which was not a gambling hall but a massive ballroom and entertainment complex, the glass-bottom boats touring the kelp forests. Up on Mount Ada, Wrigley hosted a very different class of visitor: silent film stars, industrialists, politicians. These people did not take the public steamship. They arrived on private yachts. They did not stay in the hotels. They stayed in the mansion or in exclusive guest cottages Wrigley built nearby. The island was developing a two-tier social structure: the masses below, the elite above. Geographically literal, economically literal, and Wrigley, positioned at the apex, mediated between the two worlds without fully belonging to either. He was too rich and too controlling to be a man of the people, but still too recently rich to be accepted by old money. The island was his solution, a kingdom where the hierarchy was of his own design. In 1929, Wrigley launched the construction of his most grandiose project yet, the Avalon Casino. Not a gambling hall, gambling was illegal, but an enormous circular Art Deco building housing a ballroom that could accommodate 3,000 dancers and a movie theater with 184 seats. The construction cost exceeded $2 million, roughly $60 million today. The timing was insane. The stock market crashed in October 1929. The Great Depression began. Banks collapsed, unemployment soared, and Wrigley kept building. This decision revealed both the best and worst of his character. On one hand, he was providing jobs when jobs were vanishing across America. Construction workers on Catalina had steady paychecks while their counterparts on the mainland stood in breadlines. On the other hand, the casino was a monument to ego. It was named after him, implicitly if not explicitly. It represented his vision of what leisure should be: organized, supervised, profitable. Wrigley's philosophy during the Depression was paternalistic, bordering on authoritarian. He believed that his duty was not to give charity, but to provide employment. If you worked, you ate. If you did not work, you left the island. This was social Darwinism with a smile. The island economy was entirely dependent on one, man's willingness to spend. If Wrigley decided to stop investing, Avalon would collapse overnight. And increasingly, from the vantage point of Mount Ada, Wrigley was a man under siege, not from external enemies, but from his own body. 4. The prisoner of elevation. By 1930, William Wrigley Jr. was 68 years old and dying, though he refused to admit it. The medical diagnosis was angina and congestive heart failure. His doctors were blunt: reduce stress, avoid exertion, consider moving to a lower elevation. The hilltop mansion, perched at 350 feet above sea level, was literally killing him. The thinner air, the steep climb, the constant stress of micromanaging an empire, all of it was grinding his heart to failure. But descending from the mountain was unthinkable. To leave Mount Ada would be to admit weakness. And Wrigley had built his entire identity on the appearance of invincibility. So he stayed. The Otis elevator, originally installed as a luxury, became a medical necessity. He moved between floors mechanically, preserving energy, avoiding stairs. The man who once walked Chicago streets for 12 hours a day now rationed every step. His world contracted. He stopped attending baseball games in person, watching through binoculars instead. He stopped hosting large dinners, delegating social functions to Ada. The solarium, designed as a space of observation and power, became a gilded cage. He sat in his chair looking out at the bay, watching ships come and go, but increasingly disconnected from the activity below. This was the tragic irony of the mansion's design. It was built to allow Wrigley to see everything, to be omnipresent through vision. But vision is not participation. The more he watched, the more isolated he became. The house, intended as a throne, became a prison. The telescope that once symbolized control now symbolized distance. Enter Philip Knight Wrigley, the son and heir. Philip, known as PK, was the antithesis of his father. Where William was loud, Philip was quiet. Where William craved publicity, Philip avoided cameras. Where William relied on instinct and charisma, Philip trusted engineering and data. Born in 1894, Philip had grown up in the shadow of his father's success, and the weight of that shadow was crushing. William wanted Philip to be his clone, a dynastic continuation of his personality. He pushed Philip into the family business, groomed him for leadership, paraded him in front of shareholders. But Philip had no interest in being a showman. He was fascinated by mechanical systems, radio technology, and aviation. He wanted to tinker with machines, not manage people. The father-son relationship became a slow-motion tragedy, a collision of incompatible temperaments bound by blood and obligation. By 1931, as William's health deteriorated further, Philip was forced into operational control of the Wrigley Company and the island. He attended meetings, signed documents, made decisions, but he did so with visible discomfort, like a man wearing a suit that did not fit. Contemporaries noted his terseness, his unwillingness to engage in small talk, his preference for written memos over face-to-face conversations. Philip was competent, even brilliant in his own way, but he lacked his father's instinctive understanding of mass psychology. The tension between them was palpable. William confined to the mansion, issuing orders that Philip executed without enthusiasm. Philip, resentful but dutiful, knowing that he would inherit an empire he never asked for. Ada caught between them, trying to mediate, trying to preserve peace in a house where silence was becoming louder than words. Meanwhile, the Depression raged on the mainland. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25%. Banks were failing weekly. Hoovervilles, shantytowns of the dispossessed, sprouted in every major city. Catalina Island, by contrast, remained a bubble of relative prosperity, insulated by Wrigley's spending. The steamships still ran. The hotels stayed open. The casino hosted dances where big bands played and people forgot, for a few hours, that the world was collapsing. But this prosperity was artificial, sustained entirely by Wrigley's willingness to hemorrhage money. The island was not economically self-sufficient. It was a subsidy machine. Wrigley was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to maintain the illusion of paradise. He could afford it, but the question hung in the air. What happens when he is gone? In late 1931, Wrigley's physicians insisted he leave the island. The humidity, they argued, was exacerbating his heart condition. Reluctantly, Wrigley agreed to spend the winter in Phoenix, Arizona, where he owned another mansion. The departure from Catalina in December 1931 was staged as a temporary relocation, but everyone understood the truth. He was not coming back. The boat that carried him away from the island passed below Mount Ada. Wrigley, sitting on the deck, looked up at the white mansion gleaming in the sun, empty, silent, waiting. The house had fulfilled its purpose. It had elevated him above the world. But elevation, carried to its extreme, becomes exile. He never saw the island again. 5. The concrete sarcophagus and the empty tomb, January 26, 1932, 6 in the morning, Phoenix, Arizona. William Wrigley Jr.'s heart stops. Doctors record the cause as an apoplectic stroke and cardiac arrest. He is 69 years old. Within hours, the news reaches Catalina Island via telegram. Flags lower. The steamship line suspends its cheerful music. The island, built as a monument to one man's will, freezes in collective uncertainty. But sentiment takes a back seat to logistics. The Wrigley family, guided by lawyers and financial advisors, must move quickly. The estate is vast and complex. The chewing gum company, the baseball team, the island, properties across the country. Philip Wrigley, now the head of the empire, coordinates the arrangements with the efficiency his father taught him, even if he does so without enthusiasm. The body is transported back to California, then loaded onto the steamer Avalon for the final voyage to the island. Thousands of people line the pier when the ship arrives. The casket, bronze and massive, is offloaded with ceremony. A procession forms, winding up the serpentine road toward the Wrigley Memorial, a structure that had been under construction during William's final years. The memorial itself is a revealing monument. Located in Avalon Canyon, about a mile inland from the town, it rises 80 feet from the canyon floor. Built from local stone and decorated with tiles produced in a factory Wrigley had established on the island, the memorial is a hybrid of mausoleum and botanical garden. The design is imposing, almost pharaonic. This was to be Wrigley's eternal vantage point, a place where his physical remains would merge with the landscape he claimed to love. The burial, however, is not a simple interment. Fear dominates the proceedings. The 1930s are the era of high-profile kidnappings. The Lindbergh baby in 1932, the body of Charles Ross decades earlier, countless extortion plots targeting wealthy families. The Wrigleys are terrified of grave robbers, criminals who might steal the body and demand ransom from the heirs. Paranoia drives the solution. The casket is lowered into a vault, and then, layer by layer, tons of steel-reinforced concrete are poured on top. The grave becomes a bunker. This is not rest. This is entombment. Philip Wrigley oversees the process with grim determination. His father wanted to be part of the island forever, and Philip ensures that the body is locked into the geology itself, immovable, irretrievable. The symbolism is heavy. William Wrigley, the man who could not control his own mortality, is imprisoned in concrete by his son. But the mansion on Mount Ada stands empty. Ada Wrigley, now a widow, does not live there. The house is too large, too laden with memories, too isolated. She stays in the family's other properties, visiting Catalina occasionally, but never residing in the Hilltop Palace. The staff maintains the house in perfect condition, dusting furniture, trimming the gardens, as if the master might return at any moment. But the rooms echo with absence. Philip inherits everything: the company, the team, the island, the mansion. And he is utterly unprepared for the emotional and logistical weight of it. Unlike his father, Philip has no desire to be a king. He understands numbers, systems, and efficiency. But he does not understand spectacle. He does not want to stand on the terrace and survey his domain. He wants to be left alone to work on his radio equipment. Nevertheless, he steps into the role because there is no alternative. And almost immediately, he begins making decisions that horrify the old guard who worked with his father. Philip is a pragmatist. He sees the Catalina Island operation for what it is: a cash furnace. The island loses money every year. The only reason it survives is because the chewing gum company subsidizes it. Philip's instinct is to cut losses, streamline operations, reduce inefficiency. But he also understands, in a way his father perhaps did not, that the island is more than a business. It is a public trust. Thousands of people depend on it for employment. Millions associate the Wrigley name with Catalina. To abandon the island would be a betrayal of his father's legacy, even if that legacy is economically irrational. So Philip makes a compromise. He keeps the island operational, but begins shifting the family's focus away from empire building and towards stewardship. This philosophical transition is subtle but profound. William Wrigley wanted to own and control. Philip Wrigley begins to think about preservation and eventual transfer. But before that transfer can happen, the world intervenes. 6. War, evacuation, and the violation of the tomb. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. The United States is at war. Within days, the West Coast erupts into paranoia. Japanese submarines are spotted off California. Rumors of imminent invasion spread. Military authorities designate the entire Pacific coastline as a defense zone, and Santa Catalina Island, sitting 22 miles offshore, becomes a strategic liability and asset simultaneously. The Navy moves in. Tourists are evacuated. The steamship service is suspended. Catalina, which had been a playground, transforms into a military training base. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, uses the island's rugged terrain for covert operations training. Marines practice amphibious landings on the beaches. The island's population plummets from several thousand to a few hundred essential personnel. The Mount Ada mansion, requisitioned by the military, becomes officers' quarters. Soldiers sleep in Ada Wrigley's floral bedroom. The billiard room becomes a strategy center. The solarium, once William Wrigley's observation post, is used by Navy spotters scanning the horizon for enemy ships. The house, built as a private fortress, is occupied by the state. The irony is almost poetic. But the most dramatic and secretive event of the war years happens not in the mansion, but in the canyon at the Wrigley Memorial. In 1942, military analysts assess potential invasion scenarios. If Japanese forces capture or bombard Catalina, the symbolism of desecrating William Wrigley's tomb would be a propaganda disaster. The military, in consultation with the family, makes a decision that would have horrified the patriarch. They will move the body. Under cover of darkness, in an operation whose details remain partially classified, the concrete vault is breached. Jackhammers and cutting torches, the very tools of industrial demolition, are used to open the tomb that was supposed to be eternal. The bronze casket is extracted, loaded onto a military vessel, and transported to the mainland. William Wrigley Jr., who bought the island to achieve permanence, is removed from it in secret, his final rest violated by the exigencies of global war. He is reinterred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, a sprawling commercial cemetery that caters to Hollywood and industrial elites. The grave is dignified but unremarkable, one among thousands. The grand vision of eternal oversight, of remaining part of the island's landscape, is abandoned. The memorial on Catalina remains, of course. The tower still stands. The gardens still bloom. Tourists visit and assume they are standing at the founder's grave. But they are not. They are standing at a cenotaph, an empty monument. The tomb is a lie. Philip Wrigley, who authorized the removal, never publicly discusses it. The operation is kept quiet for decades. The official narrative is that William Wrigley rests on the island he loved. The truth is that he was evicted by history. The war years are transformative for Philip in another way. With the island under military control and the chewing gum business facing ingredient shortages due to rationing, Philip makes a decision that defines his leadership style. He withdraws Wrigley's spearmint and juicy fruit from the civilian market entirely, sending all high-quality production to the troops overseas. For domestic consumers, he introduces a substitute brand, Orbit, made with inferior ingredients but sufficient to maintain market presence. This is strategic patience. He sacrifices short-term profit to preserve the brand's reputation. When the war ends and quality ingredients become available again, Wrigley's gum returns to shelves, and consumers welcome it back as a symbol of normalcy restored. This is the decision of an engineer, not a showman. William Wrigley would have fought to keep the brand in stores, loudly advertising his patriotism. Philip quietly withdraws and lets the market forget. Both strategies reflect intelligence, but they are the intelligence of different men. By 1945, the war ends. The military leaves Catalina. The island, battered and neglected, is returned to civilian control. Philip faces a choice: rebuild the tourist operation or walk away. The mansion on Mount Ada is damaged. Salt air and military occupation have taken a toll. The gardens are overgrown. The white paint is peeling. The house is no longer a symbol of power. It is a relic. Philip, against the advice of accountants who see only liabilities, decides to rebuild, not because he loves the island, but because abandoning it would dishonor his father. This is duty, not passion. And duty for Philip is a burden he carries without complaint, but also without joy. 7. The benevolent dictator becomes a ghost. The post-war years, from 1945 to the early 1970s, represent a slow decline in the Wrigley family's direct involvement with Catalina Island. Philip Wrigley continues to subsidize the island's operations, but he does so from a distance. He visits, occasionally, but he never stays in the Mount Ada mansion for extended periods. The house, once the nerve center of the empire, becomes a guest residence for business associates and company executives. It is maintained impeccably, but it is no longer inhabited. It is a museum of a dead man's dreams. The island itself stabilizes economically. Tourism returns, though never quite reaching the frenzied peaks of the 1920s. The Avalon Casino, that $2 million monument to Wrigley optimism, becomes a venue for big band concerts and swing dancing. The glass-bottom boats tour the kelp forests. The Cubs continue spring training on the island until 1951, when they move their operations to Arizona. The departure of the team severs one of the last direct connections between Wrigley's chewing gum empire and the island. Philip runs the Wrigley Company with ruthless efficiency. He innovates in manufacturing, invests in advertising, and expands distribution. The company thrives. But Philip's heart is not in spectacle. He is not interested in being a public figure. He avoids interviews, declines awards, and runs the empire from behind closed doors. The contrast with his father is absolute. William wanted to be seen. Philip wants to be invisible. As the 1960s progress, Philip begins to confront an uncomfortable reality. The island is unsustainable as a private holding. Property taxes are escalating. Environmental regulations are tightening. The cultural mood is shifting. Americans are less tolerant of private ownership of public resources. The idea that one family can own an entire island, dictating who visits and how, is starting to feel futile and embarrassing. Moreover, Philip is aging. Born in 1894, he is in his 70s by the late 1960s. He has children, but none of them show interest in managing Catalina. The dynasty is dying not from conflict, but from apathy. And so Philip begins to consider the unthinkable, giving the island away. 8. The Great Renunciation. February 1975, Philip K. Wrigley, now 80 years old, sits in a Los Angeles law office with his wife, Helen. Spread on the table is a map of Santa Catalina Island, divided into parcels. Lawyers explain the structure of the transaction. Philip listens, asks precise questions, and then signs the documents. With that signature, he transfers 42,135 acres of land, roughly 88% of the island, to a newly created nonprofit organization, the Catalina Island Conservancy. The gift is irrevocable. The land is removed from commercial use forever. The value of the donation is estimated at approximately $50 million in 1975 terms, equivalent to over $250 million today. This is not a sale. It is a gift. The contract includes stipulations. The land must be preserved in a natural state, protected from development, and made accessible for public recreation and scientific research. The Wrigley family retains no control over the Conservancy's operations. This is the single most significant act of environmental philanthropy in California history at the time. And it is done quietly, with no press conference, no ribbon cutting, no fanfare. Philip Wrigley, true to form, does not want applause. He wants the issue resolved. The motivation is complex. Partly it is financial pragmatism. The tax burden of owning undeveloped land is enormous, and the Wrigley Company no longer generates the kind of cash flow necessary to justify subsidizing the island indefinitely. Partly it is ideological. Philip genuinely believes that the land should be protected, that his father's vision of an accessible paradise is better served by public stewardship than private control. But partly it is exhaustion. Philip is tired of the responsibility, tired of the scrutiny, tired of being the custodian of a legacy he never wanted. The gift is liberation. He dies 2 years later, in 1977, at the age of 82. His wife Helen passes away shortly thereafter. The Wrigley dynasty, in terms of direct control over Catalina, ends. 9. The mansion becomes a hotel, and the island becomes forever. After Philip's death, the Mount Ada mansion faces an uncertain future. It is not part of the Conservancy gift. The family retains some residential properties. For several years, the house sits largely unused. The University of Southern California briefly leases it, hoping to turn it into an executive conference center, but the logistics and costs prove prohibitive. The house, built to be a command center, does not translate well into institutional use. In 1985, a private hospitality company negotiates a long-term lease and converts the mansion into an exclusive bed-and-breakfast inn. The transformation is both respectful and mercenary. The public rooms are restored to something resembling their 1920s appearance. The bedrooms are converted into guest suites. The dining room serves gourmet meals to paying customers. The solarium, where William Wrigley once surveyed his kingdom, becomes a lounge where tourists sip wine and take selfies. The irony is thick. The most exclusive private residence in California is now accessible to anyone with a credit card and a reservation. You can sleep in Ada Wrigley's bedroom for approximately $500 a night. You can stand on the terrace where the chewing gum king watched his empire and take Instagram photos of the sunset. The house that was designed to separate the owner from the masses now sells proximity to that separation as a luxury experience. But perhaps this is the most appropriate ending. William Wrigley built his fortune by selling a 5-cent product to millions of ordinary people. The mansion, in its current incarnation, sells the fantasy of being William Wrigley. You cannot buy his power, but you can rent his view for a weekend. Down in Avalon, the island thrives under Conservancy management. The wild interior, which Wrigley once wanted to develop but never did, remains wild. Bison, descendants of a herd imported for a film shoot in the 1920s, roam the hills. Hiking trails wind through canyons. Marine protected areas surround the coast. The island is more ecologically healthy today than it was during the Wrigley era. The Wrigley Memorial remains a popular tourist destination. Thousands visit each year, walking through the botanical gardens, admiring the stonework, and paying respects at the tomb. Most do not know it is empty. The cenotaph functions as intended, a place to honor memory, even if the body is elsewhere. 10. What money can and cannot buy. The story of the Wrigley Mansion is not a simple morality tale. William Wrigley Jr. was not a villain. He was not a saint. He was a man who used the tools of capitalism to create something that was, in its own contradictory way, genuinely beneficial. He provided jobs during the Depression. He made natural beauty accessible to working-class families. He preserved, albeit for selfish reasons, a landscape that might otherwise have been strip-mined or paved. But he also built a fortress of isolation and called it paradise. He created a system of total control and called it benevolence. He wanted to be loved and respected, but he designed his life to prevent intimacy. The mansion on Mount Ada is the physical manifestation of that contradiction. It is a house that invites you to look but not to touch, to admire but not to enter, unless, of course, you pay. The deeper lesson is about the limits of wealth. Wrigley could buy an island. He could buy infrastructure, steamships, a baseball team. He could buy labor and loyalty. But he could not buy acceptance from the social class he envied. He could not buy immortality. He could not even buy permanent rest. His body was evicted from the tomb he built. What Wrigley could buy, and what he did buy, was control over a small piece of the world for a limited time. He imposed his vision on Catalina Island, and that vision, filtered through his son's pragmatism and the Conservancy's environmental mission, persists. The island today is a hybrid of his dream and its negation, accessible but protected, developed but wild, private property transformed into public trust. Philip Wrigley, by contrast, understood something his father did not. Legacy is not about ownership. It is about what you leave behind when ownership is no longer possible. By giving the island away, Philip ensured that the Wrigley name would be associated not with exploitation or exclusivity, but with preservation. He turned his father's kingdom into a commons. That is a more enduring monument than any mansion. The Mount Ada Mansion still stands, white and austere, visible from the bay. Every ship captain entering Avalon Harbor sees it first. It is a beacon just as William Wrigley intended, but it is no longer a symbol of power. It is a symbol of transformation. A private throne became a public relic, a fortress became a hotel. The house that was designed to elevate one man above the world now allows thousands to briefly experience that elevation. And the island itself, the 76 square miles of rock and scrub that a soap salesman bought on a whim, endures. The bison graze, the kelp sways, the ocean pounds the shore. The land, which Wrigley thought he owned, owns itself now. He was just passing through. This is the real story of the Wrigley Mansion, not a story of triumph, but of limits. Not a monument to success, but a reminder that every empire, no matter how carefully constructed, is temporary. The house on the mountain watches over the island, but it does not rule. It never really did. If you found this exploration valuable, consider supporting this channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing. History is not made of myths. It is made of choices, consequences, and the quiet erosion of even the grandest ambitions. Thank you for watching. The story of Mount Ada does not end with its transformation into a hotel. That would be too clean, too convenient. Because beneath the polished narrative of philanthropic redemption and preserved wilderness lies a messier truth about inherited power, the psychology of dynasty, and what happens when a family's mythology collides with the machinery of modern capitalism. We need to go deeper, into the parts of this story that don't fit the official narrative, into the question of what the Wrigley Empire actually meant for the people who lived under it. 11. The people who built paradise and were not invited to stay. Stand on the terrace of Mount Ada today, glass of champagne in hand, $500 per night charged to your card, and look down at the city of Avalon. The view is spectacular, but it is also a view of erasure. The official Wrigley narrative celebrates William as a benevolent industrialist who saved the island during the Depression. This is not entirely false, but it is incomplete, dangerously so. Let us return to the construction period, 1919 to 1921. The Mount Ada Mansion does not build itself. Somebody has to haul the limestone blocks up that serpentine road. Somebody has to install the plumbing, the electrical wiring, the hardwood floors. That somebody is an army of laborers whose names appear nowhere in the promotional materials. The workforce on Catalina in the 1920s is divided into strict castes. At the top, managers like David Renton, white men from the mainland with engineering degrees and direct access to Wrigley. In the middle, skilled tradesmen, also predominantly white, who operate the heavy machinery and supervise construction. At the bottom, Mexican and indigenous laborers who do the backbreaking work. Wrigley pays well by the standards of the time. This is documented. But payment is not the same as inclusion. The workers who build Mount Ada are not permitted to live anywhere near it. They are housed in a separate labor camp on the far side of the island, out of sight of tourists. This is not accidental geography. This is apartheid by elevation. The social engineering Wrigley practices on Catalina is a microcosm of American class structure compressed onto 76 square miles. He genuinely believes he is creating paradise for everyone. The beaches are open. The dance hall welcomes all paying customers. But certain spaces remain sacred. The mountain is one. The golf course is another. And most revealing of all, the residential development called Mount Ada Estates, which Wrigley begins planning in the mid-1920s. The vision is to sell luxury lots surrounding the mansion to approved buyers. Approved is the operative word. The sales contracts contain restrictive covenants, legal clauses that explicitly prohibit sale or rental to non-whites. This is standard practice in American real estate of the era. But it is also a moral choice. Wrigley has absolute control of the island. He could have broken the pattern. He does not. The irony cuts deep. Wrigley makes his fortune selling a 5-cent product to the masses. He positions himself as a populist, a friend of the working man. Yet when he builds his private kingdom, he replicates the exact social hierarchies he claims to transcend. The mansion on the hill is not just architecture, it is ideology in stone. By 1930, Avalon has a population of approximately 3,500 permanent residents. Most work directly or indirectly for Wrigley Enterprises. They are shopkeepers, boat captains, hotel clerks, groundskeepers. Their livelihoods depend entirely on the whims of one family. This is not a community. This is a company town disguised as a resort. The psychological impact of this arrangement is profound. Residents speak of Wrigley in hushed, reverent tones even decades after his death. Not because they love him, but because they fear the alternative. What happens if the family sells? What happens if a new owner decides the island should be developed differently? The benevolent dictatorship creates a culture of dependency that persists long after the dictator is gone. And here is the uncomfortable question that historians often avoid. Did Wrigley save Catalina, or did he simply purchase the right to shape it according to his personal preferences and then call that salvation? The answer is both, and neither. This is the trap of trying to impose simple moral judgments on complex economic relationships. Wrigley provides employment that would not otherwise exist. He also extracts value from labor while maintaining iron control over every aspect of workers' lives. These truths coexist. The mansion itself becomes a symbol of this duality. Visible from everywhere, accessible to almost no one. A beacon and a barrier. The workers who laid its foundation could never afford to sleep in the rooms they built. Their children could play on the public beach, but not on the mansion's private terrace. This is the geometry of power. When William Wrigley dies in 1932, the workers of Avalon grieve publicly. Flags lower, businesses close. But in private conversations, a different emotion emerges, uncertainty bordering on terror. The question on everyone's mind is not, what will we do without him, but what will be done to us now? Philip Wrigley, the reluctant heir, inherits not just wealth, but this web of dependency, and he feels its weight differently than his father. William saw the island as his creation. Philip sees it as his burden. 12. The architecture of loneliness and what the mansion really reveals about wealth. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in very large houses built for very small families. It is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of emptiness made audible by scale. The Mount Ida Mansion has approximately 16 rooms spread across 3 floors and over 8,000 square feet. For most of its active life as a private residence, it houses exactly 4 people regularly: William, Ada, their son Philip, and occasionally Philip's wife, Helen. The ratio of space to occupants approaches the absurd. This is not accidental. This is the point. Wealthy Americans in the early 20th century do not build big houses because they need the space. They build big houses because size itself communicates status. But there is a psychological cost to this equation that is rarely discussed. Ada Wrigley spends an enormous amount of time alone in this mansion. William is obsessed with work. Even when physically present on the island, he is mentally absent, consumed by telegrams from Chicago and management decisions. Philip, as soon as he is old enough, flees to the mainland for school and then for his own pursuits. Ada is left as the mansion's primary occupant. She fills the silence with projects. The garden becomes her obsession. She imports rare plants from across the Southwest. She supervises the landscaping with the same intensity William applies to business. But this is not just a hobby. This is a survival strategy. The garden gives purpose to days that would otherwise stretch into unbearable monotony. Letters from Ada to friends on the mainland reveal a woman struggling with isolation. She describes the beauty of the island in glowing terms, but between the lines, a different story emerges. She mentions the difficulty of maintaining social connections when living on an island accessible only by boat. She references the challenge of finding intellectual stimulation in a resort town. She notes, almost in passing, that the view from the terrace, while magnificent, never changes. This is the curse of paradise. Perfection is static, and the human mind craves variation. The architecture of Mount Ada, designed to project power and control, becomes a cage for its primary resident. The solarium, that glass-walled observation room, is particularly telling. William designed it to see everything. But for Ada, it is a room where she sits and watches a world she cannot quite reach. The tourists below are having fun. Her husband is working. She is suspended between them, alone at the top of the mountain. When William dies, something shifts in Ada. She does not immediately leave the mansion, but her use of it changes. She stops maintaining the formal dining room. She closes off entire wings. She consolidates her life into a smaller suite of rooms on the second floor. The house, always too large, becomes a monument she inhabits rather than a home she lives in. Philip notices this. After his father's death, he suggests multiple times that his mother move to the mainland, to a smaller, more manageable property in Pasadena or Los Angeles. Ada refuses, not because she loves the mansion, but because leaving it would feel like abandoning her post. She has become the keeper of the shrine. This is the psychological trap of legacy. The mansion was built to celebrate William's achievements, but after his death it becomes a mausoleum for Ada's sense of duty. She cannot leave because the house represents something larger than her personal comfort. It represents the family's claim to permanence. The servants who work in the mansion during this period report an atmosphere of melancholy. The rooms are spotless, the silver is polished, but nobody comes. The guest bedrooms remain empty. The billiard room sits unused. The house is maintained at great expense for ghosts. Ada dies in 1958, 26 years after William. By the end, she is spending less than a month per year on the island. The rest of the time, the mansion is staffed but unoccupied. This is wealth at its most absurd. Paying a full-time crew to maintain a home nobody lives in, because selling it or closing it would be an admission that the dream has failed. The lesson here is not that wealth cannot buy happiness. That cliché is both obvious and unhelpful. The lesson is more specific. Wealth at this scale creates obligations that consume the very freedom it is supposed to provide. The mansion is not an asset. It is a responsibility that outlives its usefulness. When the University of Southern California acquires Mount Ada in the late 1970s, they inherit not just a building, but a maintenance nightmare. The roof leaks. The foundation is cracking. The plumbing, installed in 1920, is disintegrating. The university estimates it would cost over $2 million just to bring the house up to modern safety codes. They consider demolition. Seriously, there are meetings where engineers present plans for tearing down the mansion and replacing it with a modern conference center. What saves Mount Ada is not its historical significance. What saves it is the view. The location is too valuable to waste, so they patch the roof, update the electrical, and lease it to private operators. The mansion survives not because it is loved, but because its position on the hill still generates economic value. This is perhaps the most honest expression of American values. We preserve only what we can monetize. Today, guests paying premium rates to sleep in Ada's bedroom rarely think about the woman who spent decades there in elegant isolation. They photograph the view, they post to social media, they enjoy the glamour. But the melancholy that soaked into the walls remains. You can feel it in the hallways at night when the other guests are asleep, and the house settles into its natural silence. The architecture reveals a truth about wealth that the Wrigleys themselves may never have fully understood. Beyond a certain point, accumulation becomes subtraction. More space means more distance. More rooms mean more emptiness. The mansion was built as a throne. It functioned as a prison. And now it is a hotel where strangers rent the illusion of what the Wrigleys discovered was an illusion all along. 13. The baseball team and the economics of distraction. The Chicago Cubs. We mentioned them earlier as a marketing tool, a mechanism for generating publicity for the island. But there is a deeper story here about how the wealthy use sports as both business strategy and psychological crutch. William Wrigley acquires majority control of the Cubs in 1921, the same year Mount Ada is completed. This is not coincidence. Both purchases serve the same function. They are stages on which Wrigley can perform his vision of benevolent capitalism. The Cubs in 1921 are a mediocre team with a passionate but small fan base. Wrigley sees potential, not potential to win championships. That is secondary. Potential to sell an experience. He understands something that modern sports franchises have only recently mastered. People do not buy tickets to watch athletes perform. People buy tickets to feel part of something larger than themselves. Wrigley Field, the stadium in Chicago that still bears his name, is renovated under his ownership to become not just a venue, but a destination. He plants ivy on the outfield walls. He refuses to install lights, insisting that baseball is meant to be played in daylight. These are not practical decisions. These are aesthetic and philosophical choices designed to sell nostalgia and tradition. The spring training on Catalina fits perfectly into this strategy. By bringing the Cubs to the island every February, Wrigley creates a narrative. This team is special because it trains in paradise. The players themselves find this narrative suffocating. Training on an island means isolation. It means limited access to nightlife and entertainment. It means being watched constantly by management. But for Wrigley, control is the point. On Catalina, the players cannot get into trouble. There are no speakeasies, no gambling dens, no distractions. The island becomes a rehabilitation center disguised as a resort. Players who struggle with discipline on the mainland are sent to Catalina to dry out and focus. The Cubs train on Catalina from 1921 to 1951, a 30-year run interrupted only by World War II. In that entire period, the team wins exactly 0 World Series championships. They appear in the World Series 3 times and lose every time. By any competitive measure, the Catalina experiment is a failure. But by Wrigley's measure, it is a triumph. The Cubs become one of the most valuable franchises in baseball, not because they win, but because they sell a story. The lovable losers, the team that plays in a beautiful stadium, in a beautiful city, and trains on a beautiful island. Losing is not a bug, it is a feature. It creates perpetual hope, which is more profitable than occasional victory. Philip Wrigley inherits the team when his father dies and immediately grasps the futility of chasing championships. Instead, he doubles down on the experience. He maintains the Catalina training tradition long after it makes logistical sense. He resists pressure to sell the team even as operating costs soar. The Cubs are not a business. They are a legacy obligation, like the mansion. In 1951, Philip finally moves spring training to Arizona. The official reason is logistics. Arizona has better facilities and is more accessible. The real reason is that Philip is exhausted. Maintaining operations on an island 30 miles offshore is grinding. Every decision requires boat transportation. Every emergency becomes a crisis. He keeps the Cubs. He abandons Catalina. The end of Cubs training marks the beginning of the island's decline as a Wrigley priority. Without the annual influx of athletes and media, Avalon loses a significant revenue stream. Tourism continues, but the glamour fades. The island transitions from exclusive destination to middle-class vacation spot. Here is the economic reality that the mythology obscures. The Wrigley empire on Catalina was never self-sustaining. It operated at a loss for most of its existence, subsidized by chewing gum profits. William could afford this because his mainland businesses generated such enormous cash flow that the island's losses were rounding errors. But Philip, facing post-war inflation and increased competition in the gum market, cannot maintain the subsidy forever. The Cubs and the island are luxuries the family can no longer afford. Yet selling either would be a betrayal of his father's memory. So Philip enters a decades-long limbo, maintaining assets he neither wants nor can profitably operate. The Cubs are finally sold by the Wrigley family in 1981, 60 years after William first bought them. The sale price is $21 million, which seems like a significant return until you calculate the carrying costs over 6 decades. By any rational accounting, the Wrigleys lost money on the Cubs. But they gained something harder to quantify, a permanent association between the family name and American mythology. Even today, decades after the family sold the team, people still say Wrigley Field and think of chewing gum. The stadium is a three-dimensional advertisement that cost hundreds of millions to maintain over a century. Was it worth it? Financially, probably not. Psychologically? That depends on how much value you place on immortality. The mansion on Catalina and the stadium in Chicago serve parallel functions. Both are monuments that outlived their practical utility and became too symbolically important to abandon. Both trap the Wrigley family in an endless cycle of maintenance and nostalgia. Both demonstrate that the wealthy do not escape the past. They become imprisoned by it. 14. The Conservation Gift and the Myth of Altruism. February 1975. Philip Wrigley signs over 88% of Catalina Island to the Catalina Island Conservancy, a nonprofit organization created specifically to manage the land. The media hails this as one of the great conservation achievements of the 20th century. Environmental groups celebrate. Politicians from both parties praise the Wrigley family's generosity. But let us examine the economic reality behind the headlines. By 1975, the Wrigley family has been trying to offload the island for years. Not publicly, that would damage the brand. But privately, lawyers have been quietly shopping the property to potential buyers. The problem is that nobody wants it, or more precisely, nobody wants it on the terms the Wrigleys demand. The island has become an enormous liability. Annual maintenance costs exceed $2 million. Property taxes are climbing. Federal regulations are tightening. Environmental groups are threatening lawsuits over development plans. The California Coastal Commission, newly empowered, is blocking construction permits. What was once a feudal kingdom has become a bureaucratic nightmare. Selling the land to developers would generate a massive one-time payment but trigger catastrophic capital gains taxes. The Wrigleys would lose more than half to federal and state governments. Worse, such a sale would destroy the family's carefully cultivated image as stewards of the land. The public? Relations damage would be incalculable. The conservation gift solves all these problems simultaneously. By donating the land to a nonprofit, the Wrigleys receive a tax deduction worth tens of millions of dollars. The donation offsets income from other sources, reducing the family's overall tax burden. They also escape the ongoing maintenance costs and liabilities. And they get to be celebrated as environmental heroes. This is not to say the gift is cynical or worthless. The land is protected. The Conservancy does excellent work. The ecological outcome is unquestionably positive. But the narrative of pure altruism is incomplete. This is a tax strategy that happens to benefit wildlife. The Conservancy model is brilliant precisely because it aligns private interest with public good. The Wrigleys shed a burden. The public gains protected wilderness. Everybody wins. But we should not mistake strategic optimization for selfless generosity. Philip Wrigley, the reluctant heir who spent his life trying to escape his father's shadow, achieves something his father never could. He figures out how to let go. William hoarded. Philip releases. But the release is not an act of weakness. It is an act of calculated wisdom born from decades of struggle with an inheritance he never wanted. The mansion, notably, is not included in the conservation gift. The Wrigleys retain ownership until 1978, when they transfer it to USC. This separation is telling. They will give away the wilderness, but the symbol, the house on the hill, requires more careful handling. It must go to an institution, not into commercial hands. Even in letting go, they maintain curatorial control over the narrative. The Conservancy, for its part, becomes the new feudal lord of Catalina. It owns the land, sets the rules, determines access. It is a gentler dictatorship than William Wrigley's, constrained by nonprofit regulations and public oversight. But the structure is fundamentally the same, a central authority, deciding what happens on the island, who can use it, and under what terms. The residents of Avalon, who live on the 12% of the island not donated to the Conservancy, find themselves in a strange position. They are no longer subjects of the Wrigley family, but they are now neighbors of an organization with enormous power over their lives. The Conservancy controls the water supply, the roads through its territory, and access to much of the island. Over the decades that follow, tensions emerge. Homeowners want to build, expand, improve their properties. The Conservancy says no, citing environmental concerns. Both sides are right and both are wrong. This is the complexity of managing a place where private property and public interest collide. What is never mentioned in the celebratory press releases is that the conservation model works only because the Wrigleys first enclosed the land. They purchased an entire island, held it for generations, and then decided its fate. The residents, the workers, the people who actually lived on Catalina had no say in this process. They were spectators to decisions made in boardrooms in Los Angeles and Chicago. Is this better than the island being chopped up and sold to the highest bidders? Absolutely. Is it democracy? Not even close. This is enlightened autocracy followed by enlightened oligarchy. The outcome is preferable to many alternatives, but the process reveals how little voice ordinary people have when the wealthy decide to be philanthropic. The Conservancy today manages the island with genuine dedication. They restore habitats, protect endangered species, and maintain trails. But they also charge access fees, restrict camping, and limit recreational use. The wilderness is protected by being controlled. This is conservation as enclosure by other means. William Wrigley would have hated this arrangement. He wanted dominance, not delegation. Philip Wrigley understood that dominance is exhausting and ultimately futile. Better to create an institution that will maintain your vision after you die than to watch your empire crumble in your lifetime. The conservation gift is Philip's revenge on his father and his own liberation. It is a rejection of the hoarding mentality that built the mansion. It is also an admission that the model is unsustainable. Nobody, not even the Wrigleys, can maintain private control of 76 square miles indefinitely. The mansion, now a hotel, and the wilderness, now a conservancy, represent two possible fates for inherited wealth: monetize or donate, commodify or protect. The Wrigleys did both. They kept what could generate income and gave away what would generate prestige. This is not cynicism. This is pragmatism dressed in the language of virtue. And maybe that is enough. 15. What the mansion means now, and what we pretend not to see. Walk through the Mount Ada mansion today, and you will encounter interpretive plaques explaining the history. They will tell you about William Wrigley's vision. They will mention Ada's garden. They will note the architectural style and the famous guests who once visited. What they will not tell you is that you are standing in a crime scene. Not a literal crime. Nobody was murdered here. But a crime against possibility. This house and the system it represents is evidence of a fundamental theft, the theft of collective potential by private accumulation. The resources that built this mansion, the labor, the materials, the engineering expertise, could have built schools, hospitals, public housing. Instead, they built a palace for one family. The profits that maintained it for decades could have funded pensions, research, infrastructure. Instead, they subsidized isolation at 350 feet elevation. This is not an argument for abolishing private property. This is an observation about scale. At a certain point, wealth accumulation becomes wealth extraction. The Wrigley fortune was built by paying workers as little as possible while charging consumers as much as possible and keeping the difference. This is how capitalism functions. We know this. But the mansion forces us to confront the aesthetic consequences of that function. This is what inequality looks like when rendered in stone and glass. Not a cartoon villain's lair, but a tasteful, beautiful home that required the exploitation of thousands to build and maintain. The modern hotel sanitizes this reality. Guests are told they are experiencing history, inhabiting a piece of the American dream. What they are actually experiencing is the privilege of temporarily purchasing access to a tier of society permanently closed to them. You can rent Ada's bedroom for a night. You cannot become Ada. The view from the terrace is magnificent, but it is also the view of a landlord surveying tenants. Every boat in the harbor represents someone paying fees to the Wrigley Enterprises or their successors. Every building in Avalon was constructed under Wrigley authority or with Wrigley permission. The beauty is real. So is the power structure that created it. This does not make the beauty less valuable, but it should make us uncomfortable. We can admire the craftsmanship and acknowledge the injustice. Both things are true. The problem with mansion tours and luxury hotels is that they encourage amnesia. They let us pretend that wealth like this emerges naturally from talent and hard work, rather than from systems designed to concentrate resources at the top. William Wrigley was talented. He was a marketing genius and a tireless worker. He was also the beneficiary of an economic structure that allowed him to capture the value created by thousands of employees while they remained wage laborers. The mansion is the dividend paid out from that arrangement. When historians call Philip Wrigley's conservation gift an act of generosity, they are not entirely wrong, but they are letting him off too easily. Philip did not sacrifice. He optimized. He found a way to dispose of an asset that was costing money while gaining tax benefits and public praise. This is not heroism. This is competent wealth management. The real tragedy is that we have so lowered our expectations of the wealthy that when they stop extracting every possible penny from a situation, we applaud them as saints. The bar is subterranean. Mount Ada survives because it can be commodified. The wilderness survives because it can be controlled. Both outcomes are preferable to strip mining and condo developments, but neither represents a fundamental challenge to the system that created the Wrigley fortune in the first place. The mansion today is a museum of its own contradictions. It celebrates a man who got rich selling something nobody needed while claiming to care about the common good. It honors a family that preached accessibility while living in literal elevation above everyone else. It preserves a structure built by people whose names we do not know and whose descendants cannot afford to visit. This is American history in microcosm. Beautiful, impressive, and deeply unjust. The guests who pay to sleep here tonight will not think about any of this. They will enjoy the sunset, the luxurious linens, the included breakfast. They will take photographs and tell friends about the experience. And this is fine. We cannot live in a state of constant political consciousness. Sometimes a mansion is just a place to sleep. But sometimes, late at night, when the house settles and the ocean wind rattles the windows, it is worth remembering that every piece of comfort we enjoy was paid for by someone else's labor. Every beautiful thing we consume exists because a system decided it was more important to build palaces for the few than security for the many. The Wrigley Mansion is that system made visible. It is the triumph of capital over community, rendered in architectural form. It is gorgeous and it is grotesque. It is history, and it is crime. And now it is yours for $500 a night. The story continues, of course. The island still operates under the Conservancy. The mansion still hosts guests. The Wrigley name still resonates. But the deeper questions remain unresolved. What do we owe to the past? What do we owe to each other? What is the difference between stewardship and control? These are not questions with simple answers. They require sitting with discomfort, acknowledging complexity, and resisting the urge to simplify the messiness of human motivation into tidy moral categories. William Wrigley built an empire and a mansion. Philip Wrigley gave away a wilderness and kept a legacy. We inherit all of it, the beauty and the cost, the generosity and the exploitation, the dream and the delusion. The mansion on the mountain watches all of this with blank windows. It has survived fire, war, neglect, and transformation. It will likely outlast all of us. And perhaps that is the final irony. The thing, built to demonstrate the builder's immortality, becomes most meaningful only after the builder is forgotten. The view remains. The structure endures. But the meaning shifts with every generation that climbs that hill and looks out at the Pacific, trying to understand what this place was, what it is, and what we want it to become.